Welcome to the Futureering podcast. My name is Philip Sarek. My goal with this podcast is to highlight some of the incredible science, technology, and innovation happening in Australia and some of the key individuals who are helping to build the future. On today's episode, I'm joined by Hon from Cortical Labs, a Melbourne-based deep technology startup which are doing some incredible things. They have pioneered what they call a brain on a chip, where they're able to actually train neurons in a dish to do certain things, such as playing the game Pong in a simulated game environment. They are basically pioneering an entirely new form of computing known as biological computing, which could have massive implications in the future for developing general intelligence and other applications. Right now, their technology is helping pharmaceutical companies to develop new drugs that they can test on little brain organoids that they grow in their dishes. And just the applications of this technology are so vast that it is incredible. This is one of the most interesting, exciting podcasts I've ever recorded. So definitely recommend you guys listen to this and hope you get a lot out of it, just like I did. Hon, thank you so much for joining me on today's episode of Futureering.
Yeah, thanks for having me on the show.
Yeah, it's great to have you here. Before we dive deep into all the incredible work you guys are doing at Cortical Labs, can you just give me a bit of a breakdown as to your journey, your story so far, sort of from studying at uni to all your background experience before founding the company?
Yes, let's see. How far do we want to go back? I guess let's go back to year 12. So I did year 12 here in Melbourne, Melbourne Grammar School. Graduated with ATAR of 99.8, decided to do medicine. So ended up getting into the Melbourne Uni medicine program. That was the old course where you could do it straight from high school. So it was a 6-year course. Midway through that 6 years, I did a year of research at Johns Hopkins Department of Health Science Informatics. So prior to actually doing medicine, I was very heavily involved in tech. I really enjoyed, a lot of the tech stuff. I built programs and learned how to code all through high school, and I kept that going even through my med school days. It was actually a pretty good source of income because I would do some side gigs, building websites, helping people, do some of their more technical stuff. Carried that on through med school. And then when I did my research year at Johns Hopkins, I was kind of very pleased to find out that there was a field called medical informatics where I could combine those two areas. So, what I was studying in medicine and also being able to use some technology in it. So I came back to Melbourne, finished off my clinical years, and in the last year of my clinical year, I went back to Johns Hopkins again to do my clinical elective, and it was around this time that I caught up with an old friend, and he was working for Microsoft at that point in time, and he encouraged me to enter into this student competition run by Microsoft called the Imagine Cup. So at this Imagine Cup competition, it was to challenge students to find technological solutions to the world's toughest problems. And around that time, I was also doing a course in pediatric global health, and that pediatric global health, gave me some context around things such as childhood pneumonia being the third largest killer of children under the age of 5. So that was kind of an eye-opening thing, and I said, hey, that's a pretty big world problem. Why don't we use some technology by building a digital stethoscope for a smartphone, which was, I think back in 2012 or even 2010, the brand new technology to enter this competition. So I did. We won a $75,000 grant from Microsoft, and then that, became, I guess, the seed for my entrepreneurial journey. So I graduated medicine in 2012, worked as a resident for a year or two, and then I put that on the side to form my first startup called Clinic Cloud, where we made connected medical devices. So this was way back in 2014. Was able to raise a $5 million round led by Tencent and Ping Ventures, and took that money, built a team, made product, and got it FDA and CE certified. And we were actually selling these devices. It was just really hard to figure out what the business model was, because this was medtech before medtech became a thing, and was also, I guess, pre-COVID. So anyway, that went on for a couple of years, and in 2018, I kind of put that aside and decided to fold that business because it was just too hard to keep going, and was looking for things to do. Came across an article in 2017 published by Demis Hassabis of DeepMind, where he was talking about how the machine learning and AI community needed to re-engage with the neuroscience community, because that's where essentially most of our initial discoveries were made. So I literally took that to heart, and I said, hey, why don't we talk to the guys at the Florida Institute of Neuroscience and ask them what's interesting in their space. And they told me about, hey, there was this new innovation called the multi-electrode array, where you could grow neurons on it and have electrical activity recorded and maybe even stimulate the neurons. And I said, well, this is pretty cool. We have this ability to read and write to these neurons. What if we could train them to do something interesting? And that's, I guess, the bit of long-winded story of how I ended up doing Cortical Labs.
Yeah. Well, yeah, pretty amazing story so far. So was it that sort of unique insight that you personally had that led to the founding of Cortical Labs, and then you sort of just connected those two dots that you heard about that multi-electrode array that you were talking about?
I don't know. I think it was more of a serendipitous discovery. I was, at that point in time, pretty certain I didn't want to do your traditional AI startup. So we talk a lot about ChatGPT and this large language model stuff as though it's the start of AI, but in fact, it does have a little bit of an older history. So I don't know if you were a fan of the TV show Silicon Valley, which was around the 2017, 2018 period. Yeah, and they were already making fun of all this AI stuff with the hot dog on hot stuff, and people forget how crazy a period in time that was when every app was getting funded because it was able to do some sort of image recognition. Now, the problem in doing image recognition on these kind of systems is that you are somewhat there's no technical moat. There's no barrier to entry, apart from the fact that whoever has the most amount of data was able to train the best algorithm, and no one has more data than the big tech firms, and that was a problem. So I said, well, even if you did really well, eventually, if one of the big tech firms wanted to take your tech, they could easily do it, or destroy you as a startup. So yeah, that forced us to think a little bit further out and say, what else could we do that could provide us with a bit more of a technical moat against the big tech firms? And yeah, I figured that maybe the neuroscience thing was more of a left field approach that we could potentially use to get around this.
Yeah, I absolutely love that. I love the approach you guys are taking. So most people probably go on your website and, like me, will just be like blown away. They see this brain on a chip and they're just like, what is this futuristic device that they're building? Yep. So can you just give us a bit more of a rundown as to what you're doing right now and describe your DishBrain product as well?
Sure. Let's see. Is this a video thing?
It will be, yeah.
Okay, let me see if I can share this, because they say a picture tells 1,000 words, and this actually will give you a lot of context of what's going on. Can you see the screen?
It's just loading for me.
There we go. There we go. So this is a scanning electron microscopy image. So the width of a human hair is about 50 microns. So for scale, this is 1/5 the width of a human hair. This long thing that's running across here is an axon. It's the long part of a neuron. And all these melted cheese-like things, these projections, are the dendrites. And the dendrites are you can think of it as like the roots of a tree, with the axon being the trunk. They form connections with different other dendrites from the other axons and other neurons. And they form sort of synaptic junctions that transmit information across. So we used in the previously in neuroscience we used to think that the dendrites really didn't do too much besides transmit information, but now it's starting to appear to be the case that a lot of the computation that the neurons are doing are actually also in the dendrites. So anyway, things about aside, so you can see sort of like a silhouette in the background. Now this silhouette here is actually the electrodes of a CMOS chip. And we zoom out, that's what it looks like when you zoom it out. So that green region here is when you put it through a scanning electron microscope, you get something like this. It's when you grow neurons on it. There are neurons at the moment on this green section here. And so that's essentially what we've done. We've taken neurons from two sources initially. So initially what we did was we started out, let's see if I can go to the next. What's going on? Oh, I was looking at the wrong thing. Here we go. So this is a summary of what we did once we figured out you could actually get these multi-electrode array devices to work. Was we took two sources of neurons. Firstly, it was a embryonic mice line. So we get a mouse pregnant, and then within 10 days we would sacrifice it, extract the embryos, remove the brains from the embryos, and shake it with a trypsin bath. So trypsin essentially dissolves the interconnecting proteins, and you end up with free-floating neurons, and these neurons get plated on the dish, and they adhere to the surface of it, and within 2 weeks, they form their own connections, and you can actually watch them via their electrical activity. So we initially started out with that because it turns out that the mixture of what kind of neurons and the supporting cells that they have in the brain is very complicated, and nobody has quite really figured out what the optimal mixture is. And by doing a mouse model here, we didn't really have to figure that out because nature has already provided with the optimal mix. You can think of it like a Campbell's soup tin can, ready-made soup. You just plop it in and add some water. I guess stroke of luck and insight was also, my CSO Brett had allergies and also really didn't like killing mice. So he proposed, why don't we do human-induced pluripotent stem cells? To which I said, well, it sounds pretty cool. Let's go for it. So the second source of neurons is actually human neurons. And the way we take the neurons, or we grow them, is by taking blood or skin samples from donors, using chemical compounds that are present in the body or mimicking the body's cocktail. We're able to transform these cells back into more pluripotency stage, so they can become so they become stem cells. They can turn into any other cells. And then using chemical compounds again, or using viral vectors, we can actually change these stem cells into neurons. So then we take these neurons, we plate them on the dish, we then connect it to a computer program that we write, in this case the video game Pong, and we teach it how to play the game. Now, this is a visualization that you can actually see on your own browser if you go to spikestream.corticallabs.com, and it's a voltage representation of electrical activity that's picked up on that surface of the chip. So 22,000 electrodes, 22,000 tiles. Every time there's an electrical activity, we see this spiking pattern that occurs. And what we do is we say this top region, this big top region here, we code the information where the position of the ball is to the paddle in the X and Y position. And once we feed that into the neurons, we wait a short period of time and we sample the two bottom regions here, which kind of represent like an A and B button on a gamepad. And if more activity is in A, we push the paddle up, and if more activity in B, we push the paddle down. So we do this over and over again, and we also give the neurons a positive reinforcement signal, which is, if you hit the paddle, that's a good thing, so we'll play you a sine wave. And if you miss the paddle, that's a bad thing, we'll play you white noise. And it turns out if you do all of that, the neurons learn to move the paddle to play the game. And so I guess, yeah, that is in a nutshell what we've done.
Yeah, that's pretty next level. So are you using Yamanaka factors to take the blood or skin and turn it into neurons, and then that's what you use?
Yes, that's what we do.
That's awesome. So basically, you're growing these mini brain organoids on a chip. you're stimulating them electrically, you're reading the outputs, and you have a simulated game environment,
Yep.
and it's basically learning to play Pong.
Correct. I mean, that's kind of what we are anyway, right? We're nothing more than a group of brains encapsulated in a skull. We receive information from our eyes, from our senses, and we have our hands, and we alter the world. And yeah, it's I think that is a pretty cool thing, right? That we can actually do this, but with neurons that have no senses, give them an artificial sense, and also give them an artificial limb to control the world.
Absolutely. No, that's insanely fascinating to me.
Yeah.
So while this conceptually sounds like really cool and super interesting, there's probably a million future use cases. Like, what are you doing today in terms of solving a problem? Like, who is your customer?
Yeah, great question. So there's a really interesting and fun project that we're doing internally at the company, which is we're getting these neurons drunk. We're feeding them a ton of booze, and it's not really just for shits and giggles. It's actually for an important scientific reason, which is that we need to establish that there's a dose response curve with these neurons, right? Because we want to show that these neurons are very analogous to in vivo neurons and the ones in our heads, for the reason that if we can actually prove this link, these neurons could theoretically be substitutes for development of drugs or testing of new drugs in a dish. So we use the Pong game as an analog of a computational system, right? Because if you think about it, like, what is the functional role of a brain, right? It's the compute, it's to think. Just like the heart is to pump and the kidneys to filter. Every other organ has a functional assay, except for the brain. And we think that by having this Pong game, we actually now have a functional assay, which is, can you measure how well they're playing the game as a proxy of thinking? And by doing that, we can actually start drugging them by using this ethanol thing, right? Because you and I I'm pretty certain if we got pretty sloshed, our performance in Pong would also go down, or that's the hypothesis. So we're trying to show that it also happens in vitro in these dishes. That the more you get them drunk, the worse they will play.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I feel like this could open up a lot of avenues for a lot of the current research in psychedelics and actually observing what happens when you give that to a little brain organoid, and you can really easily track all the changes and see what's going on with the electrical activity as well.
100%. I think it'd be really interesting to see like what happens when you put things like DMT, which is known to have long-term potentiation effects. Right? Are they zeroing out the connections? Right? As some people claim that they are. Things like zip kinase. Are they able to sort of like erase memories and such? Those are, I think, really interesting questions and things that can potentially be used. Can be solved, I guess, using our system.
Yeah, absolutely. So tell me a bit about the process of, I think you recently raised, was it $10 million in your latest round? Can you give us a bit of a background on that? How hard was it to obtain that, and sort of what proof did you need to show to get that investment?
Yeah, it was actually a really hard investment process, primarily because of the wackiness of the work that we're doing and the cutting edge science. There are very few truly deep tech science investors out there, and the guys who have backed us are absolute legends. So they're a venture firm called Horizon Ventures, and they're essentially, I guess, the private investment vehicle for Mr. Li Ka-shing, who's the richest man in Hong Kong. And previously, they had also backed companies like DeepMind. In fact, they were the first check into DeepMind. When nobody knew what the hell was AI, let alone reinforcement learning, and so it was hard, but we found the right match with the guys from Horizons. It's very hard when you're building a new kind of technology, right? And you talk to investors and they go, "Well, what is this? Is this an Uber for X or something for Y?" And you're like, "Probably not, because we don't have a market for this. This is novel technology." It's almost like saying, hey, William Shockley, this transistor you're building, what's your market? And you're like, well, I don't know, man. It's a thing that switches voltages pretty quickly.
Yeah.
I can only imagine that it'd be used for calculators. So it was a long drawn out process, but actually one of the things that I was somewhat hesitant to do as well was to take the investment because I didn't know, was there a product that I had in my hands, or was this purely just a research topic? And research is hard because you never know exactly how long the process is. When is it going to be done? When is it going to be published? Is it valid? And so forth. Whereas a product is more certain. You know what you need to do, what specifications you have, the people you need to hire, and potentially also you can accelerate the process with more people working on it. So I was somewhat hesitant to actually do a proper raise until June last year, after catching up with people like Professor Mark Carter, who kind of convinced me that yes, while the world needs a biological computer, it's not needed today. Whereas what we need are systems to help people, find cures for diseases, understand how the brain works better, and more in that sort of life sciences aspect.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. And I think, yeah, when you're doing something so fundamentally different
Mm.
and true deep technology, it makes it all the more difficult. So that makes me really wonder, like, there must have been so much inertia and resistance to, like, make that first step to building this. Like, you had this rough idea,
Hmm.
maybe we can build this biological computer on this chip. How did you, like, what was that little switch that happened there? How did you take the first step? Was it like, I'm going to talk to this person, I'm going to find some co-founders? Like, how did that work?
Um, I don't know. I think it was more of you know, pure naivety and just going, well, I have no idea what a biological computer is, but it sounds pretty cool, so let's go build it. Mind you as well, like this was also on the back of my I guess early stage where the company was my previous company had not really done very well, and I was trying to fold it and do something else with it. So yeah, I mean it's an interesting one, right? Like how he ended up doing this. Um, yeah, good question.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think it was also more of trying to understand how things work and get it going. I mean, here it's actually quite interesting that you talk about this because I'm just looking through my very earliest decks, just trying to figure out what the hell was I thinking during that period of time. I mean, yeah. I mean, a lot of it is also trying to understand, like, here we go. I'll show you some. Uh, well, I don't want to leave the Riverside studio, but I want to show you things that we were thinking about even from that point in time.
Yeah.
Where is that? Here we go. Let's try it out. So share screen, window. I mean, this is like blast from the past. Holy crap, 2019. It's funny that when you keep all these old decks, it's like, how are we going to do this, right? And we're like, well,
Yeah.
you have a real life organism, you have a mouse. A mouse has a real brain. It has hands and feet, nose and whiskers, and a cheese maze. Well, what is the common thing? It's a neuron. So, well, we put it in a multi-electrode array. We're gonna get video in, and we're gonna have like an output, and maybe if we just keep doing this, we could get something like a mouse, right? And yeah, I mean, this was the initial diagram of like, well, what could we do with this stuff?
Yeah.
But this was also all motivated by like, you know, concepts like peak silicon and when is the end of Moore's law coming, and what is this whole thing about unconventional computing? Do we need to start thinking about alternatives of what's going to happen, right? And looking at more theoretical things like p space versus np hard pro. Sorry, p equal np and the p space kind of like problem sets, which is interesting because a lot of AI solutions actually operate outside of the p space into np hard problems, right? But the way we do it using AI or even with biological intelligence is that we figure out the boundaries, right? And we don't compute all the possibilities because it's a lot of it is incalculable. So if you have boundaries, then you can actually save a lot of the computation by only calculating the most probable sort of outcomes, right? So for instance, we know there's a phenomenon like gravity. Why bother calculating if a thing is going to float, right? So I don't know. A bit of a long aside, but yeah, I think it was more of a, just thinking about it, right? Like thinking about the context of where things are. You know, if we had this multi-electrode array device, what can we start doing with it, right? And I think that's just the way I think in general, which is more of a kind of a MacGyverish thing. Like I have a Swiss Army knife here, and I have a can of Coke. What am I going to do to make stuff from that? What I'm given?
Yeah, absolutely. I got to get my hands on that deck because I saw the comparison with quantum computing, and that seems to be all the hype these days.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So, how does this compare to, say, neuromorphic computing? How similar or dissimilar are they?
I would say it's very dissimilar, and the reason for that is the neuromorphic people have taken a textbook from the 1970s that said this is what we think a neuron looks like and how it's working, and they've turned it into silicon computing devices. Now, the problem here is that even now in neuroscience land, we don't quite know what the hell these neurons are doing or how they're doing it. And the more research we do, the more wackier they become. So in many cases, neuromorphic is as the name suggests, it's neuron-like, but it's not actually what the neurons are doing. And so I would say that the neuromorphic systems are, I guess, one step closer to what the brain is doing, in the sense that we don't have your classical von Neumann architecture where you have a separation between memory and compute. And so, most of the time on most computers is just shuffling memory across a bus. In biological systems, memory is stored in the same place that compute is happening, which is in the neuron. Neuromorphic systems kind of do a lot more similar things like that, but the overall architecture of a neuromorphic system is also very much simplified compared to what we actually know is happening. So yeah, I mean, and even neuromorphic also has various levels of neuromorphism, right? Like some people assume that just having a spiking neural network is good enough. The spiking being, a leaky integrated fire model, which is, a tried and true model. But then again, there are also now, new research that comes out to show that that may not necessarily be the only model of how a neuron works. So yeah, I think it is somewhat different. One is inspired by the another one, but the inspiration only goes so far.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, when I see what you're doing, it sort of makes me think, can this eventually be used to sort of study the nature of consciousness itself? And could a brain organoid exhibit sentience or intelligence close to a human at any point?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and one that needs to be had with the bioethicists. There is a big refrain, I would say, to get to that point in time, and it's for good reason as well. The question needs to be asked of why do we want, if we can, why do we want conscious organoids, right? And there has to be a very good reason for it, I think. We can't just go ahead and just make it because we want to. Because these are sort of, I guess in today's society, sort of ethical red lines, are we creating conscious things? Are they suffering? And so on and so forth. I do think a technology like this could theoretically get to that point in time. But as I said, the question needs to be asked, why are we doing it? And valid reasons for that could potentially be coming from the biomedical aspect of things, right? The life sciences research. For instance, if let's say in order to cure dementia, we would need to create a semi-conscious system, is that a worthy ethical trade-off, right? That we need to do something like that in order to get to a cure that will help a lot of people. And this is something that, we can't do it by ourselves. It's a two-way conversation, right, between us and the industry versus what society believes and thinks. And the example I would give would be things like IVF treatments, right, where 1978 the first test tube baby was born, and there was a lot of pushback. The religious right were considering this somewhat unethical because life was only something that God could create and so on and so forth. But look at it today in 2023. What is it? 30% of, well, maybe not 30, but like 20% of pregnancies are somewhat assisted. May not necessarily be full IVF, but there is some assistance with it. And Medicare is now subsidizing, IVF treatments. So we've come a long way in terms of society accepting a technology that was somewhat considered evil and unethical in the past to going, well, it does seem to provide a lot of happiness to couples who otherwise would not have had children. Maybe it is not such a bad thing after all. So it's one of those things with that big consciousness question, which is there a good enough reason why we should be looking into this? Is there a negative outcome potentially from this? And then having that conversation with society in general to say, guys, we could do this. The pros of doing it is this, the cons of doing it is that. Is this something that is worthy for us to consider doing? And I think this is something that the AI space, at least with the large language models, are somewhat, grasping the challenge, right? Which is, yes, it's really great that all these AI systems could potentially write my essays and, spit out code. But there's also the harmful aspect of fake news, deep fakes, and so forth. Is that benefit worthy for the potential damage that it could be caused? Because if you think about it, if we were to outlaw, ChatGPT and so forth, the worst outcome would be, I guess, we all go back to doing what we were doing, which is writing essays, writing code, back to the status quo. Which is that really such a bad thing? It's up for society to decide that, and I think we're having that discussion right now, particularly with what OpenAI is doing with terms of legislation and regulation.
Yeah, absolutely. It does sort of become a bit of a philosophical, moral, ethical question, I guess, as to like where is that line where consciousness begins and ends, you know what I mean? We don't really understand that. Is it some emergent property at some level of complexity? Like these are all interesting questions.
100%. I mean, even people in the space occasionally make the mistake of conflating sentience with consciousness, right? And you go, well, if you are interchanging these two words, why would they even exist as separate words in the first place?
Yeah, absolutely. And do you think this is likely able to actually lead to true AGI? And do you think it's more likely than what we're doing now with sort of these software algorithms?
Well, I mean, it's hard to say, but one thing we can say for certain is that we've never built a silicon AGI, or we haven't yet that we know of. But biological AGI is, well, not AGI, biological GI is all around us, right? You and I are examples of that. A dog, a cat, even a fly, I would say exhibit true GI. So I'm pretty certain that this is if we're using the same building blocks and same materials, we would end up with GI. Is it AGI? Is it BGI? We don't know. But yeah, we know we know what the outcome is. We just don't know whether that's the case. And I think this is the same thing with quantum computing, right? Quantum computing is theoretically known to have all the attributes that we are working towards. And I think that's the reason why quantum gets a lot of funding and a lot of attention, because Feynman proved that you could do a lot of things using this quantum computing at accelerated pace. The question now is, how do we engineer systems that exploit the quantum phenomenon? So I think it's similar to this in the biological space. We know what the outcome is. It's how much engineering do we need to do to get to that outcome?
Yeah, that makes a whole lot of sense. We're in a pretty interesting time right now where we're like at the precipice in the beginning of like all these different computing architectures and forms. So it's going to be interesting to see how the next 10, 20 years develops.
100%. I think this is important, right? Because we've I say this because I've observed this over many years of technological development, is that we've kind of tapped out a lot of the low-hanging fruit. So if you think about the vast majority of all the big tech stuff that we've seen today, it's essentially built on technologies that have massive amount of government, public, and research funding to get off the ground. So take, for instance, Salesforce. At its heart, it's a database. It's a SQL database that people put, sales contacts in and so forth. It's probably one of the most valuable companies on the planet. Built using a database system that was developed in the 1970s. Facebook, right, initially was built using PHP and MySQL. These were technologies that were around, since the mid 90s, early 2000s. And then you have a whole host of all the other applications out there, these SaaS businesses that are using technologies that have existed for a long while now. And so the question becomes is how many more are we going to keep looking at, or how many more applications can we keep building using these old technologies before we run out of ideas and we then need to start looking at alternatives? What are the big, great unsolved problems today, right? Things such as automation in the real world, things like robotics. How do we build systems that improve the productivity of a country and so forth? These things will not be solved with more SaaS businesses. They need to be solved using more deeper technologies, potentially ours, quantum, AI. I say AI, like proper AI research, not a slap on an app in front of the ChatGPT API.
Yep, precisely. So your role as CEO of this very, very deep tech startup, what does that look like day to day? Are you doing technical work? Are you building chips? Are you looking at neurons? Or are you more, holding the vision, doing sales, operations, raising money? What's that sort of look like?
Yeah, it's very varied. Like some days it'd be, talking to investors, raising money. Other days it's, talking to current investors, giving them updates and such. So, as a tech CEO, you have two roles essentially, which is, the outer facing public role, right? Dealing with investors and so forth, talking to people like yourselves, journalists, getting the word out and trying to explain the technology. And then internally as well, I help set the vision, deal with strategy. I also do technical work occasionally. I drop in and I help the team technically sometimes. And also, it's also great for what I do because, I do go to things like conferences and trade shows. And it's great to see colleagues, in adjacent fields because there is so much potential for cross-pollination. So I just came back from a trade show and I came across guys who were building flexible wafers for chips, and I was like, wow, this is so cool. Could I use this for our next product? So what I do is I because I have regular contact and I'm deep with the product development, is also try to think about new technologies that could be integrated into what we do to make the cost of the device cheaper, more accessible, give it better capabilities and forge ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. And what is sort of like the future long-term goal with Cortical Labs?
Yeah, so I think the long term goal really is to build a platform that will help this field grow. So people ask like, what does success look like? And I say success looks like 10 startups or even 10 companies that are well funded, well funded and also make good money, solving problems for people in various verticals using our technology. So we think that we are very, very early, but also B in a very important role to develop the base layers of the technology for other people to start using to apply it into various verticals. If you think about it, it's kind of like the NVIDIA or the Intel business model, right? Like if you ask Intel which business they're in, they say we're in the chip business. And then people go, what the hell is the chip business? Well, the chip business essentially is to build general purpose computing devices that can then be used for gaming, can be used for architecture, can be used for music creation, right? It's up to the user to then apply that technology to. So I think we want to be in that similar space where we don't think we don't want to get into too deep into any particular vertical, except for maybe the life sciences one, because we think this is so important. We have to get going with this now rather than wait for somebody to build this. But for everything else, cybersecurity, for the robotics, for the actual BI or AI tasks, we would love more people to come on board and experiment with the tooling that we're developing build applications around them.
Yeah, that's awesome. So you guys are going to be like the platform. Maybe 10, 20 years from now, there'll be other founders, startups coming and building their own
Right.
applications for it, whether that's, different forms of software or, robotics, obviously, and things of that nature. That's really interesting.
Yeah, 100%, right? Because I think, it is much larger than just Cortical Labs. What we're working on, I think, is a new field of science, right? And no one company can do this by itself. It needs an ecosystem of participants, an ecosystem of people with various diversity of backgrounds and experiences, right? So, like for instance, ChatGPT really is, if you think about it, a simple prompt that returns you text, right? That's simply what it is if you ask somebody. But because of the plurality of people using it, it now has so many various applications, right? If you're a code developer, it spits out code for you because you've asked it and prompted it to do a code task. If you're a musician, it's spitting out music lyrics because you've asked it to do it. And, a coder and a musician come from very different backgrounds and contexts. But they're using the same tool. So this is the same thing that we look at with our technology as well, which is very general purpose at the moment. We have ideas of how they could be used, but we don't think those are the only ideas. There are many out there that needs to be exposed to people, and the accessibility needs to be made to be a lower barrier to entry, so that regardless of your background and where you are, you could get started on this technology.
Yeah, amazing. So something I'm really passionate about right now, and kind of the reason why I started this podcast, is to figure out, how do we actually build the future? And a lot of that comes down to building what you're doing, so deep technology. So I'm just sort of I'm talking to a lot of people trying to really figure that out. What is that process? So I want to ask you, do you have any advice for someone wanting to build something in deep tech, start a deep tech startup, do something which is going to impact a lot of people?
Yeah, I think if you're thinking about it, you're already on the right track. It's so easy to be tempted to go, well, I could build another app for this or another web service for that. Building deep tech is hard, and takes a great deal amount of commitment. But I think it's also great because you are at the forefront of the technology, right? I mean, you could seriously look back in many years' time and go, wow, when we started, no one else was doing this, right? And we're kind of in that phase at the moment. So I think the key advice is really just to do it, and know that there will be a lot of naysayers, a lot of people who would say, why are you doing this? You could be doing X or Y or Z. But just ignore it and just keep pushing on as far as you can. Be passionate about the technology, right? Understand where it is, what you have, and also be realistic. It's hard to build deep tech. You're never going to get 100% of what you want to do. The question is, at what threshold do you need to get to get past to the next stage? And I think it's deep tech is not as well funded as other fields in tech. So being resourceful is going to be an important skill to have, right? Like knowing what do you have in your hands, what else can you obtain given the limited resources and budget that you have, and what are the stepping stones that you need to get to in order to prove your technology and hopefully raise more to get you to the next phase and next level. And I think this is something that is in hindsight a really great skill that I learned while working as an emergency doctor. Because in emergency medicine, you have two things. You are constrained by resources. You can only do what you have given the amount of time or resources that are at hand. And B is triaging, right? Triaging how important a category of patient is. Is this a Cat 5 small laceration, or is it a Cat 1? It's a cardiac arrest, right? And it's a dynamic situation because you're always changing that triage category. Your resources are continuously shifting, and I think that's the important bit as being a deep tech CEO and founder is understanding that most of your time is actually doing that, which is what resources do I have at hand, and how important are the problems I'm trying to solve here in triaging them. Because there are, in deep tech, there are just way more problems than you can actually solve. So you just need to triage the severity or the importance of it and allocate the resources that you have to try and solve it.
Yeah, awesome. Do you think there's an opportunity and we should be looking at what we're doing in universities, fundamental research and actually commercializing that? Is that a pathway to building more deep tech startups and products and technologies?
Yeah, 100%. There's like so much good stuff happening in our university labs that unfortunately never see the light of day. And there are many factors involved. Some of it could be the culture of academia, which is, yeah, I discovered this, but my KPI is to publish, and I can't publish old stuff. I got to keep moving on, and so these ideas are left to wither at the vine. The other things are also, even if you wanted to do it, the IP restrictions around it makes it very difficult for anyone to take an idea and run it all the way through to commercialization. And so I've always been a strong advocate for safe harbors for technology or new technologies, right? That have been developed, potentially at university, to be in a space where founders are not worried, constantly looking over their shoulder going, oh my God, if I keep working on this, is the university going to take it from me? To a point where they can go out and say, look, you know what, this is a safe space, I can keep working on this. And eventually turn it into viable businesses that the technology can hopefully move from bench to bedside, right, or into commercial products. So I think there's a significant amount of work, potential reform that needs to be done to encourage more people from the university research sector to commercialize the technology.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a problem in itself, right? I think even the whole tech transfer process could be disrupted because it just seems to be very, very inefficient and not really getting the outcomes that we need.
I mean, yeah, 100%. Like, the tech transfer process is also a little bit too, I think, rent-seeking in terms of behavior. Sure, maybe somebody did, some work while they were doing the PhD or, they were a postdoc and so forth. But if it wasn't for the person deciding that they were going to take this and turn it into their life's work, that IP that the university has essentially is worth zero anyway. So universities need to wake up and go, what is the point of collecting a huge trove of these IP if no one is going to actually take them and run along with the whole process? And I think this is something that people need to start thinking about, right? It's the same thing as well in investment space where people are worried about percentage points, like, oh yes, am I owning 20% or 21% and so forth, when it really doesn't quite matter so much, because what you really need to be thinking about is how big is this pie, because the 10% of 100 million is better than 100% of a $5 million company or something like that. Maybe I didn't get it right. Anyway, it's been a long day. You get the point.
Yeah, absolutely. Awesome. Just like a final question I'd love to ask is, what is your vision of the future and how do you hope to build that future?
Yeah, I mean, I think the trends that are happening right now, particularly in the Western world, it's going to be really hard to figure out what's going to happen in the developing world, is if you look at places like Japan, which is usually several decades ahead of the West, is that there is a trend of declining populations. So an aging population, declining fertility rates is going to be, I think, a factor that will permeate through not just Japan, but places like Australia, the UK, Europe. I mean, we're already seeing this in Europe right now. I think there's like a significant drop in fertility, which then means that you end up with an inverted population pyramid, right? How are we going to get the world to continue running if vast majority of the population are say 60 and over, that are no longer fit for doing like laborsome work and so forth? So I think the key for that is actually automation, robotics perhaps is probably going to be the key, and we need to start thinking about transitioning the economy from things like GDP and production and economic growth as a KPI of how well a particular country is doing, to things such as, well, if let's say in the future we have a lot of automation through robotics and so forth, what really matters, right, which is looking after people. Maybe that could be the KPI for the future, right? How caring are we as a society? Maybe the vast majority of the jobs that humans will retain may not necessarily be, hauling, bricks up, putting it on a wall, but maybe could be looking after one another, nursing, medical, aged care. Those could be the future industries where humans need to, invest in. So I think, it is an interesting time we're heading towards, and I don't think there's anything that's going to change this huge population demographic shift that's coming over the coming decades. And so we then need to start preparing for that, and think about how the technologies we're developing, maybe it's through AI, maybe it's through BI and so forth, will help ease that transition, so that we all can maintain the same quality of life that we have, maybe improve it, but also adapt to the changes in that are coming from the demographic and also in climate.
Yeah, I love that. Amazing. So before we close off, where can our listeners go if they want to find out more about you or Cortical Labs?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a Twitter. So we have Cortical Labs Twitter. We actually have a very active Discord. So on our website.
Oh, amazing.
Yeah, they can go over to the Discord. I can also pass you the link for that. We have a subreddit. The Reddit is not as popular as the Discord. I guess people want to have answers immediately, kind of thing. And some of my team are actually also on the Discord because we love talking to people, and just exchanging ideas.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah, shoot me a link. I'd love to join the Discord, actually.
Yeah, 100%. Yep.
That would be awesome. Anyways, Hon, thank you so much for joining me. I had a great time chatting and learning more about you and your startup. And the work you guys are doing is super important, and I think, very interesting. So keep it up, and keen to see where you guys go in the next few years.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on the show, Philip.